Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the best recording of Furtwängler's Symphony No. 2. Yes, Wilhelm Furtwängler. He was a composer as well as a conductor. Most conductors are actually composers at some level or another. I mean, whether or not they're any good at it, it seems to be good practice for them. Otto Klemperer was a composer. Paul Kletzky was a composer. George Zell was a composer. You know, some are better than others at certain things, but certainly composition winds up becoming part of the trade of conductor as often as not. And so Furtwängler was indeed a composer. He wanted to be a composer permanently before he actually became a permanent style, career-oriented conductor. But he was a dismal failure as a composer in the early decades of the 20th century. He all but gave up, actually, and his mature work consists of 3 symphonies, of which numbers 1 and 3 are absolutely atrocious. And then there's this really long violin sonata that's horrible, and there's this symphony concerto for piano and orchestra, which some swear by, which is an incredibly long, dark, murky mess of a piece, which we may talk about at some future time. But the bottom line is, whether he was successful or not successful, he was able to grind out one relatively fine work, and that was the Second Symphony. Now, Furtwängler's style was hopelessly retrogressive. People talk about Bruckner, the comparison to Bruckner all the time, but I don't really think that's apt. Furtwängler's style was actually even less interesting than that. And I don't mean it sounds like it was earlier, and I don't think when I say less interesting, that doesn't mean he didn't write good music within that style. But the style itself was a concatenation of Wagner and Reger, and in its sort of chromatic, sludgy, thick, and you know, he looked at the symphony, of course, as the ultimate mode of, shall we say, transcendental expression. But what makes Furtwängler's performances, or Furtwängler's composition, so interesting, at least with regard to the Second Symphony, is that he wasn't a transcendental style composer at all. You would think that he would just be dying to get his teeth into the grand Brucknerian adagio. And although the Second Symphony has many adagio-like passages in the outer movements particularly, which are quite long, it actually has a slow movement of great simplicity and charm. It's marked andante semplice, which means basically simple, and it's the shortest movement in the whole symphony. So he was not the transcendental adagio composer that he idolized in Bruckner. Mahler was much more that than Furtwängler ever was. Mahler knew how to write true adagios. As Richard Strauss pointed out, when he was conducting Mahler's Fourth Symphony, he said, I could never do something like that. I couldn't write that kind of adagio. And neither could Furtwängler. Not, at least he didn't in the Second Symphony, and if he did elsewhere in some of his other works, those works are total failures. So that speaks for itself. Why are they failures? They're failures because they are incredibly long for their content, because the thematic material is pretty much undistinguished, and because ultimately they just have too many dead spots. The Second Symphony has many fewer of those. I mean, it's really a fine piece. And so I think it's worth talking about. It's been recorded half a dozen times. That in itself is tacit acknowledgement that there's some real musical substance there, that a bunch of conductors did it. And I am going to talk about 4 of those 6 recordings. Well, I mentioned the other 2. There are 2 that I think are just at a level below the others. One of them was on Marco Polo. It was with Alfred Walter, I believe, of the BBC Symphony, and it's out of print. Maybe you can find it. I don't see it anywhere. I've looked around. And the other was on Arte Nova with the Staatskapelle of Weimar under Werner Andreas Albrecht, which was also just, a really second-level performance of a work that, like all music, deserves to get first-class treatment. So how many performances of the Second Symphony are there? First, It has two big, long outer movements, then that semplice slow movement of considerable charm, and then a really interesting scherzo, which is the best movement of the symphony. And you wouldn't think that Furtwängler would be best at writing the scherzo, but he was. It has a wonderful trumpet tune at the climax. It's got energy and movement. It's really quite marvelous. The finale is this grand contrapuntal fugal concatenation, kind of what you might think a German composer might do when he knows he has to write long but is running out of ideas. But somehow he pulls it off. He really does. And Furtwängler wrote and Furtwängler conducted, pardon me. There are two recordings of the symphony. Let's start it that way, featuring Furtwängler himself. One is on Deutsche Grammophon. It's a studio recording made in the 50s. It's in this box here, where he had an opportunity to do it. And of course, that's the work he chose as well. And I think that's also significant in terms of his estimation of the value of his various compositions. So he recorded it, and then there's a live one that's on Orfeo, which I don't have with me here, but I have it. It's over the overflow room, that way. And it's with the Vienna Philharmonic. And of the two, the Orfeo is better as a performance. It's a little tighter, a little bit more exciting. It's basically sonically equivalent. They're both recorded, it's mono and it's not great sound, but they're quite listenable. It's not played fabulously with the Vienna Phil. They make some mistakes here and there, and Furtwängler being Furtwängler, he doesn't know what to do about it, or doesn't get them not to do it, or whatever it is. So his two recordings, but they're important. They're important, of course, as any composer's versions of his own music are going to be important. But the Orfeo is the better of the two. Then there are the two studio recordings, which I have right here, or recordings by other people that are really, 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 really good. The first of these is Baronboym and Chicago. Now, I happen to have been with him at one point when he received a Cannes Classical Award for his Beethoven cycle. We talked about the fact that he was planning to record a Furtwängler symphony. And at that time, he told me he was planning to do the first. And I said, no, do number two. Please do number two. And in the event, I'm not making any claim to have had anything to do with it, but we did have the conversation, and it was interesting. And he did do number two. Ultimately, this is the one that he actually did with Chicago, and it's an extremely fine performance, brilliantly played, wonderfully recorded, and you can actually hear, like, there's a bass drum and tam-tam at the finale, which you can't hear anything of in Furtwängler's performances, and it's quite splendid. It really, really is great, and it's on Teldec. Again, I'm not sure what the status of it is now, but it shouldn't be too hard to find. And it was very exciting when this came out because it demonstrated, first of all, that the piece really does work by itself, even though it has very, very long movements and it does have its little dead spots here and there, but it generally worked quite well. And that it's a very well-written piece. It's well orchestrated. It had the Furtwängler's own performances have textures that kind of clog up now and then, but this doesn't. It's also a little bit on the heavy side, even for Furtwängler. Furtwängler was a more eruptive conductor than Baronboym was, however much Baronboym seeks to emulate him, but it's an excellent performance by any standard. However, there is another one. There is another one that's even better, and it's better than even Furtwängler's performances. Not surprisingly, it's Eugen Joachim. Eugen Joachim with the Bavarian Radio Symphony Orchestra. And it's on BR Classic. It's still out there, I believe. I've seen it recently. And let's see when it was recorded. Let me just make it perfectly clear. Here we are, 1954, December 1954. It's a live recording. Again, it's mono sound, but it's better sound than Furtwängler himself got. And boy, oh boy, Joachim is a wonderful conductor of this music, as you might expect. Not because he gets the style, which he does, but because he's just a wonderful conductor. Period. The cool thing about this performance is that it has the best balance of form of all of the performances. That is, Joachim actually conducts a first movement and finale of almost exactly the same time, about 26 minutes each, and he's perkier in the finale than just about anybody else. The performance is more accented and vibrant. It's a marvelous performance. However, if you want great sound, and you really should hear it in great sound, then you've got to hear the Baronboym. These are your choices. Baronboym and Joachim. Now, Furtwängler's own, I mean, if you're a Furtwängler person, you'll get a Furtwängler box or something like this, and you'll get one of his second symphonies too. Or you can try and find the Orfeo, which I also don't see is available at present, so who knows. It's not a work that's going to last in the catalog very long because it's not a popular piece, and it probably never will be. It's a big, long, heavy, occasional piece. But it's Furtwängler's best composition, and it shows that he actually had something in there trying to get out. There's some very interesting speculation, actually, about his career in Nazi Germany, which, of course, his fans will like drool and pant and heave and breathe fire when I mention, but I think it's really a very valid one. Is that one of the things that kept him in Nazi Germany is that he wanted desperately to be thought of as a composer. He worked at these pieces slavishly, although he never finished anything. It wasn't until actually after the war that he was able to put the finishing touches on most of these large works of his, what you might call his late period. It's kind of ironic, but it was only in Nazi Germany where his style, his music would have been accepted because he was so out of the mainstream of where composition was going. And so he would have been, to the extent his music had any chance of being welcomed anywhere, that was the time, that was the place, because that was the aesthetic. That was what the Nazis were trying to impose on music by banning everything and everybody who had Jewish influences or, Antarctica influences, as they say, degenerate influences. Furtwängler was not degenerate. Good heavens, no. He just wasn't talented either, except for the Second Symphony. And so if you're going to hear it, you have to get one of these four performances. One of the Furtwänglers, the Baronboym, or the Joachim. And if you do that, you'll be in business. But I do recommend you hear the work. I really think it's a minor masterpiece of its type. It really is. For all the controversy, for all Furtwängler's faults, for all the fact that everything else he wrote was just dreadful, this piece has legs. And they're nice-looking legs. It's good. It's good stuff. So keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.